Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. In this week's lessons, we're going to be looking at reforms to UK democracy. Over the last few weeks, we've been looking at what UK democracy is, what that means, types of democracy, the direct and the representative, and talking about the advantages and disadvantages of that. We've also touched on this idea of how democratic Britain actually is. And what we're going to be looking at this week is how some people have suggested we could reform and improve our democracy. Now, our democracy has reformed many times over the last 200, 300, 400, well, you could even make an argument for 1,000 years, because there have been many reforms to our governmental system. But you'd have to argue back in the day of William the Conqueror that Britain wasn't a democracy at all. So it's only once Britain starts to become a democracy, once we start to get parliament in kind of like the 1500s, 1600s, and then you start to get the decline of the power of the kings and the ascent of the power of parliament, that you then have to start asking the question about, well, how effective is UK democracy in terms of giving people representation? And what you can see on the screen here, and pause the video if you need to, is some of the key events that actually increase what we call the franchise, meaning who gets to be able to vote in the United Kingdom. Now, if I just give you the highlights, and then you can kind of pause the video and kind of read this yourself. So you can see here in 1832, the Great Reform Act is what extends the franchise to new classes of people away from just the ruling classes or the very rich landowners. The Reform Act then continues going over the next 100 years. We get to men, about 60% of all adults over 21 get the right to vote. 1918 is the first time women get the vote, but also most working class men. It was a dual franchise act. And so this is obviously things like the suffragettes and so on. Then we get changes to the Voting Act in 1948, where it reduces it brings the principle of one person, one vote. So, if you've got two houses, you can't like vote in two places and things like that. 1969, we go from 21 to 18. And in the Scottish elections, we then get a reduction down to 16 years old as well. Sorry for the pause there. So these are the main reforms that have taken place over the last few hundred years. And by and large, what they do is every time they increase the franchise, meaning it allows more people to vote than were able to vote before. And whether that's just letting more men vote, or younger people vote, or women vote, or people that own land or don't own land, the general trend is that over time, more and more people have been given the right to vote in representative elections. And on this slide here, you can see what that actually means in terms of the percentage of people that are actually able to vote. So we can see here for a good 300 years, although the franchise was technically increased, in reality, it meant that very, very, very small percentages of the population were actually able to vote. And it's only this 1918 one that really shoots it up. It goes up quite significantly here in one of the previous Reform Acts, but it's actually this 1918 one after World War I where you see the massive increase of the franchise. And it's not surprising then that it's only after 1918 that you get the rise of the Labour Party, because previous to this point, it's always been a battle between the Liberal parties and the Conservative Party, both of which to an extent either represented the ruling classes or the middle classes. And once the franchise is extended, it opens the door to a party that actually represents the working class, which the Labour Party traditionally seems to. So what are the remaining issues with the voting system that we have? Well, first of all, people under 18 cannot vote. So technically the franchise is complete, but we still discriminate on the basis of age. We don't discriminate on gender or race or sexuality or anything like that, but we do on age. And of course, this is an interesting one because there may be good reason to differentiate on the basis of age, but then where do you draw the line? Is it 21? Is it 18? Is it 16? Is it 14? Should everyone have a vote? Should people be forced to vote, which is compulsory voting? Should we change the way we do voter registration? Should we allow people to vote on their iPads or their tablets or their mobile phones so they don't actually have to go in person? These are the different ways in which we could potentially reform our democracy in the future. Should we have more direct democracy by voting on our phones on a wider range of issues? Should prisoners be able to vote? This is more of a minor issue, but in the United Kingdom, if you are in jail, you lose your right temporarily to vote. Should we change that? What will happen after Brexit? What if you live abroad? Should citizens lose their rights there? Or if people come to live in the UK, then at what point should they gain the right to vote? Now, the two big issues there, back in the major ones, is this idea of under 18s voting and compulsory voting. And we're going to look at those two issues now, because these are two issues which are likely to, the first one in particular is one that keeps coming up as a topic, because it is likely that if under 18s could have voted, then the Brexit referendum could have gone the other way. Obviously, a Brexit referendum and an election is not the same thing, but the chances are if young people could vote for one, they would be allowed to vote for the other. So should the voting age be lowered? What's your initial thoughts on that? In the Scottish referendum, on independence, 16-year-olds were allowed to vote. The SNP brought that in. And it's unlikely to be a change in the UK because the Conservatives are unlikely to bring it in. Quite frankly, the Conservatives tend to have a stronger vote amongst the elderly population, so it doesn't electorally benefit them, and it doesn't really kind of ideologically fit with what they do. So it's unlikely to be an issue. But if you Google it, and I've got a Google link here, should 16-year-olds be able to vote, you will see strong, passionate arguments and sensible reasons on both sides, some of which we can put in. Now, some of these will sound patronizing, but you can be the judge of whether you think these are good arguments or not. Do young people make rational decisions? Are the decisions we make in politics too complex for younger people to understand? Do younger people not tend to pay tax, and therefore their contribution to society isn't as strong, and therefore they should not be given the right to vote yet? Do many young people simply repeat the views of their parents, so their votes are sort of kind of irrelevant, just giving their parents an extended franchise? Are the young excessively radical? Like, do they tend to go for very simplistic utopian style solutions and vote for perhaps parties that believe they can make the world a perfect place, like the Green Party or something like that? And that's not a criticism of the Green Party, but like the young tend to be very passionate about issues such as the environment. On the other hand, yes, they should vote. There's citizenship education in schools, there's A-level politics. Young people are as informed as they wish to be. It could help to raise low turnout. You know now that participation amongst the young is very low. Could it be that actually part of the reason for that is that they aren't given the vote until 18, so they're not kind of used to voting, and schools can't support? Social media helps the young to be politically informed. There's lots of political memes, for want of a better word, that go around, and people do get a lot of their political information from social media, and therefore they are politically aware in many ways. At 16 years old, you can pay tax, you can marry, you can have kids of your own, so maybe the logic would state that you should be able to vote as well, and there's no reason why you shouldn't. And perhaps the idealism of the young helps to counter the conservatism of the old. So if elderly people tend to vote conservative and younger people tend to vote more left-wing parties, then maybe you should actually allow both voices. If you're going to allow older people, then maybe you should allow younger people as well. What do you think about that? This might be a good point for you to pause the video and have a little kind of ponder, maybe kind of read around those issues. There are many lectures that you could find on this particular topic. Should we have compulsory voting? So compulsory is by law, you have to vote. And if you don't vote, then there's commonly a fine as a punishment. And the idea here is that it forces participation to go up, which increases things like a democratic mandate and the legitimacy of those people that are elected. And it kind of says to the people, well, you are a citizen and therefore your voice is important and we expect you to be politically involved. The countries on the map here in purple, you can see, are the countries where there is compulsory voting. And of course, there are countries where there is no voting at all. But the most Western countries where this is true is places like Australia and Belgium. And it does increase the turnout. As you can see here, their turnout is over 90%. Technically, of course, they don't actually have to vote. They simply have to attend. So if you really don't like any of the political parties, there's nothing that forces you to actually cast your vote for one of them. You can go and you can sign to say that you were present. Italy removed compulsory voting in, I'm not sure what year actually, but when they did it, the turnout dropped from 90% to 75%, which is still actually very high. But you can see that the difference there that the compulsory voting made to ensuring that people vote. Should we have it in the UK? Yes, it increases the legitimacy of the election winners, meaning that they have permission from the public to do what it is they have been elected upon. Yes, because it forces representatives to reach out to all sections of society. I think I mentioned this in a previous video, but if you do not have, if you know that most young people won't vote, then you do not need to put out policies that would benefit those particular groups. So by extending the franchise, it makes representatives think about all of the franchise. It may force voters to make themselves more informed about political issues. So one of the counter arguments is, well, young people don't know about politics. Well, maybe if they had the vote, they would make themselves informed. Many people don't care about politics, but maybe if they were forced to vote, then they would make themselves aware. Perhaps it's your duty. Perhaps it's simply your duty to be involved as a citizen who has rights, such as a right to an education, a right to NHS, a right to healthcare, right to employment benefits. Maybe it should also be your responsibility to vote. Turnout in local and regional elections are often appallingly low, way below 50%. And the same goes for things like police commissioner elections as well. They're down in the 30s. And so maybe making it compulsory would help to make these elections feel more worthwhile. But maybe no, maybe not. Maybe it is a civil right not to vote. Like you have the right to vote and you have the right not to vote. And maybe that should not be infringed. Maybe it could lead to ill-informed participation. People almost like tossing a coin or voting on the benefit or basis of liking someone's personality or not really understanding or voting on particular issues. Enforcing the rule would be expensive. Normally when a person is fined, the government actually makes a loss because the process of that fine actually costs more than the fine itself. And I hope that kind of makes sense, but it would cost money to enforce this rule, especially once you add in things like people that would appeal against it and things that happen like that. And it favors large and well-known parties. For sure, the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, Lib Dems, Greens might benefit. But what about the parties you've kind of almost never heard of? What about the far rarer parties, the far smaller parties? It could lock them out even more. But there are other possible ways that voting could be reformed as well. You could change the way that voters have to register before voting to try and make it more secure. If you remember in the recent election, Donald Trump talked about voter fraud or voter identification or people voting when they shouldn't have done. And you could arguably try and make voting more secure by changing the registration procedure before people vote. It says here, registration is a bigger issue in the USA where ethnic minorities typically don't register and therefore are underrepresented. Some people have argued that voter registration is a form of discrimination, not because it stops certain groups voting, but there are certain groups that are less likely to register, and therefore the impact is that some groups have less of a voice. It's a controversial one, and that might be one to discuss in class, but voter registration isn't just as simple as a security thing. It can be used as a way of lowering the vote of certain groups who are less likely to register. One suggestion to raise turnout is to make voting more convenient, either by allowing online voting or voting at supermarkets or weekend voting or having a vote that lasts for a few days rather than a single day. All of these potentially increase the risk of fraud or perhaps change what voting tradition is like in the UK, but they could increase participation and therefore they could increase legitimacy. Those are also topics that we can discuss. By the way, early voting does already exist, but it's a paper format. So you have to apply and then you're sent a document and then you fill it in and you send it back. But it's not the same as like having polling stations open for a few days and so on. So what I'd like you to do for this week, and you'll see this on the Nearpod, is to go and read pages 15 to 24. If you look on the Nearpod, it kind of chunks up. So you do a few pages here and a few pages there with various activities. But the reading will go through these topics that I have discussed today, looking at some of the reforms, as well as bringing in some of the additional reforms that could take place to the UK. And you'll see things there like reform to the House of Lords, reform to devolution, electoral reform, which I haven't mentioned in today's lecture, but I will be introducing when I see you in person. So these are very important for you to learn about as well. Thanks for watching. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, complete the activities as you go.